Hello and welcome to TP Talks, PwC's Global Transfer Pricing podcast series, where professionals share their insights on key transfer pricing developments. Today, we will be discussing Brexit and what it means from a transfer pricing perspective. My name is Dana Hart, and joining me today, I have Loic Webb-Martin, a transfer pricing partner in our PwC London office. Loic will be moderating the discussion today. Also from our PwC London office, I have Susan Edwards, a director with our transfer pricing practice, and Stephen Brown, a senior manager in our transfer pricing practice. Loic, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to you to get the discussion started.
Thanks, Dana. The UK Prime Minister, Theresa May, has been clear for a long time that her Brexit deal was the only one on the table. But what's become clear over the last 6 weeks or so is that the UK Parliament has rejected that deal. Right now, Brexit has been extended to the 31st of October 2019. And there appears to be little appetite from other European territories to renegotiate the terms of the withdrawal agreement. But there is still scope to adjust the future relationship between the UK and the EU27. And what seems clear now is that that future relationship will need to be reset compared to the deal that Theresa May had negotiated. In fact, it seems now much more likely that a softer Brexit than originally anticipated will be possible, with the potential for a customs union and possibly even single market access. What that means is there's a much wider range of outcomes possible now, and for companies, that makes planning more complex. Steve and Susan, I know each of you has been working with clients across a range of industry sectors, and I'll come to you shortly. For myself, I work a lot in the financial services sector, and for particularly banks and insurance companies operating in that part of the world, the lead time to prepare for Brexit has been very long because in many cases it takes a court-approved order to be able to move a back book from the UK into Europe. And the effect of that in financial services is that a lot of groups are well advanced on their Brexit planning and in many cases have already implemented their new operating model and are well advanced in terms of the transfer pricing associated with that model. Susan, perhaps if I can start with you, what's your experience of the companies and sectors that you've been advising? How are groups there developing and implementing their plans for Brexit?
Thank you, Loic. What I'd say really is that the responses from companies really generally depend on how heavily they are impacted by Brexit. So the key sectors that I've been advising on generally are either regulated businesses, so pharmaceuticals, betting and gaming, or fintech businesses, or those with significant supply chains in or out of the UK, so for example, fashion retail. The affected companies, generally have set up cross-functional Brexit steering committees, which are sort of across the business but do have finance and tax representation. Many of the companies have also undertaken detailed feasibility studies to assess whether they do need to change their existing structures, not just from a tax perspective, but also much broader from a commercial perspective, including legal, personnel, HR issues, etc. But I think, Loic, what's clear from the clients that I work with is that, given the uncertainties regarding the UK's departure from the UK, when that will happen and what transitional arrangements will be put in place, many of our clients are quite hesitant to put in place big bang changes to their structure and instead are opting for phased entries into a second EU country.
Okay, thank you. And so, Stephen, turning to you, I guess I've got two questions for you. The first is really around what the short-term or immediate impact on supply chains is. And how do you see that playing out in the near term, Stephen?
Thanks, Loic. So I think there's been a number of examples of different actions businesses have taken, both in the lead up to what was meant to be the departure date about a few weeks back and in the post-Brexit context. So some of the specific actions are building up inventory, either in the UK or in Europe. That might be in existing warehouses or in new warehouses that businesses have taken on, either for short-term or longer-term planning. Some manufacturers in particular, and this is quite prevalent in the automotive sector, have plan to shut down their manufacturing plants for scheduled maintenance, which is something they do every year, but they've timed it to coincide with the exit date. Another example I've seen with another business is realigning their manufacturing plant, so in effect moving manufacturing to where their customers are located rather than centralising by product to preempt some of the border delays that might come from Brexit.
So I'm hearing some tactical moves either to minimise the impact through inventory holding or possibly in some cases more fundamental realignment of production. If you cast your mind forward then, Stephen, what do you see as the long-term transfer pricing consequences for companies that are going through a Brexit restructuring?
I think a key factor in answering that question is going to be based on what deal is eventually agreed between the UK and the EU. However, where changes to the business operating model and their organisational structure are quite simple and basic, the transfer pricing should be quite straightforward. However, I think a key risk, depending on the amount of divergence between the two governments and agreements that are reached, is around gradual changes within a business and whether that might coincide over a long period of time with a fundamental change in the functional characterisation of the different businesses across the supply chain, and what that could mean in a Chapter 9 business restructuring context and looking at things like exit taxes and other such issues. I also feel that there is an increasing likelihood of disputes over the next couple of years as tax authorities inquire into these restructuring, and also through different transparency measures such as country-by-country reporting and European mandatory disclosure rules as well.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I'd certainly like to come back to the exit issues and the potential for disputes. And certainly from my perspective, I'm absolutely seeing that day one, if you like, where regulatory alignment is quite close, groups are much less uncomfortable about what that position means. But over the long term, as those regulatory positions may diverge, some potential for disparity and concern. So, Susan, I guess just thinking about the role of the UK within the EU, for many non-UK parented groups, and I'd include a lot of US headquartered or Japanese headquartered businesses, the UK has really been their foothold into the European market. How do you see that changing as a result of Brexit?
Well, for non-UK parented groups, Louis, given the likely disruption and cost associated with any structural changes, I'm generally seeing a fairly measured and light touch approach, certainly with non-regulated businesses. Key concerns for these businesses are really the ability to attract senior talent, recruitment of a broader workforce, which may include a lot of EU workers, business travel for non-EU nationals into the UK, so whether that is US or Japanese individuals from the headquarters coming into the UK, and often negotiating property leases with EU landlords. So, these really are some of the critical issues that have been on the minds of such groups, rather than just the tax situation. And as a result, groups are tending to implement, I'd say, small mitigating actions to deal with specific issues rather than making wholesale changes to their structures. If I think about Japanese parented groups in particular, they regularly use single entity structures with a European head office located in the UK and European branches. I think the key conclusion on the clients that I work with is that these structures are still viable and they still work. And all of the other benefits that the UK brings in terms of being an attractive location from perspective of language, location, time difference and availability of skilled workforce all still exist regardless of what's happening with Brexit.
Interesting. So consistent with Stephen then, some tactical questions being considered, but not fundamental realignment of operating or transfer pricing models. So if we perhaps move on then, I know in my experience there's a lot of groups that I'm working with who've had to move assets, in particular, as I say, in financial services, their back books from the UK into Europe. Susan, what in your experience is the interaction between the transfer pricing model and the value of any assets or business being transferred to new European structures?
That's a really good question, Louis. So obviously the TP model and hence any pricing arrangements for a new European business is directly impacted by the future profits that it can make. And those profits will then determine the price that a third party would be willing to pay for the assets that are being transferred, and hence the valuation of those assets. So, the TP and valuation aspects are closely interlinked. There clearly can be tension when you're moving assets or a business into a new European location, especially if that location is lower tax, especially where clients may want to have relatively low substance in that new territory. So low substance would generally equate to low profits in the new territory and a lower exit charge, but clearly that doesn't take full advantage of the lower tax rate in the second country. But really, the correct answer will be, highly dependent on the facts and the level of substance in the new second European country.
So a few things to balance there. One, trying to look at the value of the assets that are leaving. Two, trying to get the future tax model right, recognising substance and tax profile. And if we think about the reaction of HMRC here in the UK or other European tax authorities, I guess my experience is that HMRC certainly are alert to the sorts of issues that many groups are having to face, and that is in particular around transfers of assets and the lack of clarity around how to value those assets. I've seen HMRC recognise and engage with industry bodies, certainly across a number of the different financial service sectors that we advise on. I guess what's disappointing is that in many cases HMRC doesn't appear to have sufficiently deep knowledge of the sector to be able to provide really clear guidance to taxpayers. And the result of that is that there is often a lack of clarity or uncertainty, which makes business planning much more difficult. I guess looking further afield, the reaction of other tax authority seems to hinge in many cases on what the profit profile of the new EU business is going to look like. So granting tax equivalence to the new business based on the fact that there won't be a change in profit profile in that EU territory. Susan, how does that play out against your kind of experience in other sectors?
I'd say that some of my experience is very similar to yours, Louise, and one of the arguments that does keep popping up is about exit charges, and whether it is correct that an exit charge crystallises, especially where you have a regulated business, on the basis that that transferred business arguably has limited value to the transferor company, because if it cannot operate because it doesn't have a licence to operate in the EU, then the options that are available to it are fairly limited, and therefore the value of that business is arguably also very limited. But what we have seen, Louise, is the HMRC have so far pushed back on these arguments, and they are being quite adamant that they do expect exit charges to arise in these situations.
Okay, Stephen, I'd like perhaps just to come back to you now, because we've talked about exit charges and valuations, but I'm also very conscious that there are a number of other major tax issues that need to be dealt with. Perhaps if we can start with customs, because the customs duty position is going to be very relevant for anyone moving goods between the UK and EU border. What do you see as being the area of overlap or alignment, Stephen, when it comes to transfer pricing and customs?
I think for customs duties, that's one of the most common questions being asked in many businesses in the UK today. And that's a really difficult question to answer because nobody really knows what the customs arrangement is going to be in a post-Brexit world. So it's really difficult to answer that question. There's always been tension between transfer pricing and customs on cross-border trade, less so for EU to EU transfers. I think going forward that's going to change. How much that will change will depend on what is agreed.
Okay, so we'll wait and see, I'm hearing. And Susan, what about the VAT position? Because that can be very significant in some parts of the market.
Yes, so from a VAT perspective, then the implications for businesses really will depend largely on whether that business is fully taxable or partially exempt, and hence whether VAT is a cash flow issue or a real cost to the business. Certainly for partially exempt businesses, there can be a real tension between transfer pricing and VAT. And in the Brexit context, that will be especially the case if the existing UK business continues to provide significant support to the new European business. because any large PP charges from the UK into the EU business could result in significant reverse charge back costs. So it's really very important, Louis, that transfer pricing and VAT position is considered in tandem and that the transfer pricing is not looked at in isolation.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. And just taking a slightly different tack, Stephen, a number of my clients have been quite concerned where they're having to move their regulatory licenses from the UK to the EU or vice versa. But fundamentally, there's no real change in terms of the functions, assets and risks that are being undertaken in the UK, for example. How do you deal with that? How do you think about that when you're looking at that change in regulatory permissions, but with no fundamental change in what's going on the ground?
That is quite an unusual situation to have such significant change in such a short period of time across so many sectors without having any certainty or clarity over what the future relationship is going to be. So I think the transfer pricing, when you do make such a change, is a really interesting one, because what you've effectively got is two entities where before you had one entity, but all the functions being performed are still being performed in the UK, and that hasn't changed, with the only real difference being the regulatory oversight and some regulatory-related functionality in the new EU territory. As a matter of principle, you would expect that the transfer pricing and the profit allocation shouldn't change all that much. However, there's no real experience out there yet in terms of how tax authorities will interpret that.
Okay, thank you. And Susan, coming back to you, you've mentioned people a number of times over the course of this discussion. How are you seeing people, clients, respond to where their individuals are located? Are they using secondees more to manage resourcing across the UK and EU?
I think they certainly are, Louis. I think lots of companies are reluctant to employ significant new personnel in any new locations in the short term because they just don't know what's going to happen with Brexit, don't know when it will happen, whether it will happen, and therefore they are very reluctant to go out and hire new employees. So they are using secondees on a temporary basis, but clearly the use of secondees does potentially create PE risks which need to be managed. So, making sure that those secondees are effectively under the control and reporting of local personnel in the new EU country to make sure that there isn't any inadvertent PE risk being created.
Yeah, okay. Now, I'd like to come back to something that Stephen was alluding to, and that's that effectively across the UK and EU businesses, post-Brexit, we don't expect that there's going to be more profits in the system, so the profit profile isn't likely to change. But now that profit profile, that profit needs to be carved up potentially amongst a greater number of tax authorities and possibly reflecting a greater level of functionality, in particular around the regulatory oversight. So, Susan, how are you advising clients to prepare for the increased levels of controversy that we expect from the same size pie having to be shared amongst more territories? Is that the sort of thing that clients should think about a bilateral APA on?
I think it's certainly an option, Louis, and that will depend clearly on the territories involved, the materiality of the transactions and the complexity of the transactions. I think with clients I'm working with at the moment, I think what they're currently doing already is making sure that they've got a detailed understanding of the contribution of both the existing UK business and any new EU operations in terms of decision making and level of continued support from the UK. Also making sure that any new model that they obtain advice from, local advice from that new EU country to mitigate against the risk that they implement something that's going to act as a red flag. I'd say that most of my clients haven't quite got to the stage of documentation and defence yet, but my recommendation was clearly to be prepare upfront documentation to support any new model. And as Stephen mentioned previously, a Chapter 9 business restructuring analysis. And as you mentioned, in some situations, a bilateral APA may be an appropriate approach, but it by no means will be the right answer for everyone.
No, okay. Now, I'm conscious, Stephen, that the Brexit can has been kicked down the road for a long time now, and in fact, the latest timing, as I mentioned up front, is that we're likely not to get a decision until the autumn this year in October. That delay creates pretty significant costs for those who are building up inventories and extends the planning horizon. How should companies really be thinking about allocating those incremental costs from a transfer pricing perspective, particularly for those perhaps that are operating a principal model?
I don't think there's any easy answer to your question, Loic, and it does require an assessment of facts and circumstances. However, I think as a matter of a few general principles, you talked about a principal model. I think if historically the group has operated on a principal model and that's how the group will continue to operate going forward, it probably makes sense that the principal bears at least some of those costs. If the cost relates to servicing the UK market and the UK entity substantially bears most of the market risk of operating in the UK, then that might be a UK cost that is borne, even if the result is that it temporarily depresses what margins the UK or the principal makes for a short period of time. If the costs relate to establishing the new European business or relocating people, then it's really the entity that will get advantage of that should be bearing those costs. So I think each taxpayer needs to look at the types of incremental costs that have been incurred and evaluate for each of those costs where is its proper home, and that should drive the transfer pricing treatment.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, I think it's clear from that discussion that taxpayers have quite a broad range of challenging operational, regulatory and tax issues to deal with. And I think for most, Brexit planning is really about doing those tactical steps, the minimum required to manage the consequences of a worst-case scenario. I think up until now that has been the threat of a no-deal Brexit, and that risk does now appear to be receding somewhat. But I guess for many organisations, they've had to act already. And for those that have acted and for those that are still planning their tactical and long-term solution, the key is really understanding what that long-term model will be, including what the movement of roles and functions out of the UK is going to look like, and think about how the supply chain, including the customs and VAT implications, is going to work. And whilst there's still significant political uncertainty around the outcomes, I think what we've heard today is that many businesses are getting on with implementing their contingency planning, aware of what the transfer pricing issues and in particular the interplay with other taxes is. I guess the good news is that whichever way the political debate goes from here, the outcome for business is likely to be less disruptive than many feared a month ago. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Loic, Susan, and Steve. And thank you to everyone who listened to this podcast. If you would like further information about this topic, please contact the speakers. You can find their contact information in the description of this episode. Thank you.